If you look at a modern map of Britain, it is easy to assume that its borders are limited to the British Isles alone. However, as historians, we must take a wider, global view. When we do so, we see that there are, in fact, 14 overseas territories, where the British government continues to exercise authority, from Gibraltar, guarding the entrance to the Mediterranean, to the Falkland Islands in the South Atlantic. These territories represent the final remnants of what was once a vast empire. At its height, just over 100 years ago, the British Empire controlled around 1/4 of the world's land surface and governed almost 1/3 of its population. It was famously described as the empire on which the sun never set. Our central question, therefore, is this: how did a relatively small island nation grow into the largest and most powerful empire the world has ever known? What follows is an overview of the history of the British Empire. The origins of the British Empire can be traced back to a period long before a unified British state officially existed. For much of the history of the British Isles, the dominant political unit was the Kingdom of England. With a relatively advanced economy and a strong military, England in the medieval and early modern periods brought the smaller, independent kingdoms of Wales and parts of Ireland under its control. In contrast, to the north, the Kingdom of Scotland remained a proud and independent state, repeatedly and successfully resisting invasions from its more powerful southern neighbour. By the early 17th century, under Elizabeth I, we see the English crown beginning to look outward. The Queen issued a number of trading and exploration commissions to English adventurers, encouraging them to explore and claim territories not yet taken by other European powers. Figures such as Sir Francis Drake and Sir Martin Frobisher claimed lands in the name of England. However, these early claims were not followed by lasting settlements. The first true English colony was founded in North America at Roanoke Island in 1585. But this attempt ended in disaster as the colonists mysteriously disappeared and were never heard from again. Elizabeth I also made use of royal charters, granting them to joint stock companies created specifically to develop overseas trade. The Levant Company, founded in 1592, and the East India Company, founded in 1600, were given monopolies over English trade with their respective regions. When Elizabeth died in 1603, the English throne passed to James VI of Scotland. With his accession, James became king of both Scotland and England through what is known as the Union of the Crowns. Although James ruled both kingdoms, England and Scotland remained legally distinct and were governed separately. As king, James sought to build upon the colonial initiatives of Elizabeth by encouraging the establishment of overseas colonies organized under three main types of colonial structures. A crown colony was directly under the authority of the monarch, but in practice was administered by a royal governor and a local council. A charter colony resembled a crown colony, but operated under a corporate charter rather than a royal governor, often giving its settlers greater political freedoms. A proprietary colony, by contrast, was granted to an individual, usually the head of a joint stock company, who ruled it as a commercial enterprise responsible to shareholders. Proprietary governors typically did not reside in the colonies themselves and therefore appointed local governors and councils to rule in their place. Over time, these proprietary colonies proved increasingly difficult to manage, and many were converted into crown colonies. An often overlooked but very important development in English expansion was the plantation of Ulster. During the early years of King James's reign, Protestant settlers from Scotland and England were moved into parts of Northern Ireland. This carefully organized model of colonization provided a template for later English colonial ventures, and several key figures involved in Ulster would go on to participate in the establishment of colonies in the New World. During the 1600s, the Kingdom of England continued to expand its overseas possessions in North America and the Caribbean. Some of these colonies were entirely new creations. Others were seized from rival European powers. For example, New York was taken from the Dutch in 1665. At the same time, England was building up its trading networks in Africa and the East Indies, establishing factories and fortified trading posts. A crucial, if deeply troubling, component of this commercial expansion was the creation of the Royal African Company in 1660. Over the following decades, this company became a leading participant in the brutal but highly profitable transatlantic slave trade. Scotland, watching the success of English colonial ventures, also attempted to found overseas colonies of its own. Almost all of these efforts failed. Scottish colonies in Nova Scotia, Cape Breton and Carolina survived only a few years. The most disastrous of these ventures was the Darien Scheme of 1698, which aimed to establish a colony on the Isthmus of Panama to control overland trade between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. To fund the scheme, enormous sums were raised from the Scottish public, nearly a fifth of all the wealth in Scotland at the time. When the expedition reached the coast of Darien, the colonists named their territory Caledonia and established the settlement of New Edinburgh. However, the colony quickly succumbed to food shortages, tropical diseases, and attacks from nearby Spanish forces. A resupply attempt in 1699 failed to save the settlement, and it was eventually abandoned. Only a few hundred of the original 2,500 settlers survived to return home. The collapse of the Darien Scheme was a financial catastrophe for Scotland, wiping out much of the capital that had been invested. In the aftermath, many Scots concluded that their best hope of achieving power and prosperity lay in sharing the benefits of England's much larger and more successful colonial enterprise. By the beginning of the 18th century, England and Scotland were still formally independent kingdoms, but the political situation within the British Isles had changed dramatically following the Glorious Revolution of 1688. The Catholic king, James II, had been deposed and replaced by his Protestant daughter Mary and her Dutch husband William, who became King William III of England and Scotland. Parliament in England then passed legislation restricting the succession to Protestant heirs. This law, however, did not apply in Scotland, creating uncertainty over the future of the monarchy. Under Queen Anne in the early 1700s, efforts were made to resolve this problem by uniting the two kingdoms. The Acts of Union, passed in 1707, merged England and Scotland into a single kingdom known as Great Britain, with a unified parliament. In the decades that followed, Britain became involved in a series of wars against other European powers. These conflicts were fought not only in Europe, but also in the colonies, wherever imperial interests overlapped. The War of the Spanish Succession ended in 1714 with a British victory. In the subsequent peace negotiations, Britain received several territorial concessions from France and Spain. Newfoundland and Acadia in North America came under British control, as did the strategically important Mediterranean possessions of Gibraltar and Minorca. At the same time, the British East India Company, although technically a private company, rather than an arm of the state, was expanding its power in India and clashing with the French East India Company. A turning point came in 1757 at the Battle of Plassey, where the British defeated the local Nawab of Bengal and his French allies. This victory gave the British a dominant political and military position in Bengal, and provided a base from which the company could extend its influence across the Indian subcontinent. Over time, this expansion took place either through direct rule or through alliances with local rulers backed by the threat of the company's private armies. Further 18th century conflicts, notably the War of the Austrian Succession, and especially the 7 Years' War, brought Britain even more territory at the expense of its rivals. In North America, the British captured Quebec in 1759 and effectively ended French ambitions on the continent with the annexation of New France by 1760. Florida was ceded by Spain, leaving almost the entire eastern seaboard of North America under British control. The Treaty of Paris, which concluded the 7 Years' War in 1763, also transferred the Caribbean islands of Dominica, Grenada, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, and Tobago to Britain. At this point, Britain had clearly become the leading colonial and naval power of the age. Throughout its history, the British Empire rested on two closely connected pillars. The first was naval supremacy, control of the seas through a powerful Royal Navy. The second was vigorous, outward-looking trade protected from foreign interference. This rapid growth in trade generated immense wealth for Britain, not least through taxes levied on goods entering and leaving its ports. Yet, ironically, it was the question of taxation that would spark revolution and cost Britain its first major colony. Although Britain considered its overseas territories to be part of the sovereign realm, it did not grant them the same rights and privileges enjoyed by those living in Britain itself. In the 1760s and 1770s, relations deteriorated between Britain and its 13 American colonies as Parliament imposed taxes without colonial consent or representation. Many colonists argued that this violated their rights as Englishmen. In 1775, they formally rejected the authority of Parliament, and armed conflict broke out. Britain dispatched troops to suppress the rebellion, but in 1776, leading colonial figures assembled as the Second Continental Congress and issued a Declaration of Independence, proclaiming the creation of the United States of America. After a long and costly war lasting 8 years, British forces were defeated, and Britain was compelled to recognize American independence. The loss of the American colonies marked a major turning point in the history of the British Empire. Thereafter, British imperial efforts shifted towards Asia, the Pacific and Africa, where many regions remained outside European control. One of the most important figures in this new phase was Captain James Cook, who charted large parts of the Pacific Ocean, including New Zealand and the eastern coast of Australia, on behalf of Britain. Although Cook was killed during his third voyage on the island of Hawaii, his discoveries in the 1770s laid the groundwork for further British expansion. Australia, in particular, became important as a destination for transported convicts. Before American independence, many prisoners had been sent to the 13 colonies. After their loss, the British government looked to Australia instead. The first fleet of convicts arrived in New South Wales in 1788, and transportation continued until the mid-19th century. Britain also broadened its interests in the North Pacific. Explorers such as George Vancouver and Alexander Mackenzie mapped the western coasts of North America during the 1790s. These explorations opened up new opportunities for British traders, especially in the fur trade, and led to British expansion into the interior regions of the Rocky Mountains and beyond. The outbreak of war with France in 1803, in the context of the French Revolution and the rise of Napoleon Bonaparte, posed a serious challenge to Britain's global position. To protect the homeland and its empire from invasion, Britain devoted enormous resources to the conflict. The Royal Navy blockaded French ports and attacked French colonies overseas. A decisive naval victory came at the Battle of Trafalgar in 1805, where the British fleet defeated a combined French and Spanish force, though at the cost of the life of Admiral Lord Nelson. Trafalgar removed the immediate threat of invasion and established British naval superiority for roughly the next 140 years. When the Napoleonic Wars ended in 1815, the victorious Allied powers, including Britain, imposed new territorial arrangements on France and its allies. Britain gained several new colonies: the Ionian Islands, Malta, Mauritius, St. Lucia, the Seychelles, Trinidad and Tobago, Guyana, Ceylon, and the Cape Colony, among others. Many of Britain's Caribbean colonies were dominated by sugar plantations that relied heavily on enslaved labor. Britain had already earned huge profits from the transatlantic slave trade. However, the Industrial Revolution began to shift economic priorities towards producing goods within Britain itself, rather than depending on slave-based colonial production. At the same time, abolitionist movements gained influence and pressured the government to end its participation in the trade. In 1807, Britain abolished the slave trade throughout its empire. It was not until 1834, however, that slavery itself was formally abolished in British territories. The period from 1815 to 1914 is often referred to as Britain's Imperial Century. After consolidating control over the Indian subcontinent, the British looked to extend their influence further across Asia. Singapore was founded as a trading post in 1819 and became a British colony in 1824. In China, the East India Company, working closely with the British government, took advantage of the First Opium War. The resulting treaties in 1842 gave Britain control of Hong Kong and opened Shanghai and other ports to British trade. Yet British rule in India itself was not unchallenged. In 1857, Indian soldiers, sepoys, serving in the company's army rebelled against their British officers. This uprising, known as the Sepoy Rebellion or Indian Mutiny, spread across northern and central India. The East India Company eventually suppressed the revolt, but the conflict convinced the British government that the company could no longer be trusted to govern such an important territory. In 1858, the company was dissolved and India was brought under direct crown rule. India then emerged as the most prized possession of the British Empire, often described as the jewel in the crown. In the later 19th century, British imperial ambitions also came into competition with those of the Russian Empire. Russia sought to expand into Central Asia and towards the Mediterranean, particularly as the Ottoman Empire weakened. When Russia invaded Ottoman-controlled territories in the Balkans in 1853, Britain and France intervened on the Ottoman side, fearing that Russian advances could threaten British interests in the Middle East and beyond. The resulting Crimean War, 1854-1856, ended in defeat for Russia and boosted British confidence in its status as the leading imperial power. Despite this, rivalry between Britain and Russia in Central Asia persisted for many years in what is commonly known as the Great Game. A partial understanding was reached in 1878, establishing respective spheres of influence. In the same year, Britain took control of Cyprus from the Ottoman Empire, intending to use it as a strategic base to counter further Russian expansion. Africa, too, became a major arena for British imperial consolidation during the 19th century. British settlement in the Cape Colony increased in the 1820s, pushing Dutch-descended settlers, known as Boers, further into the interior. The Boers founded their own republics, notably the Transvaal and the Orange Free State, but these were ultimately brought under British control after the Second Anglo-Boer War, which ended in 1902. In North Africa, the opening of the Suez Canal in 1869 transformed global trade routes by linking the Mediterranean with the Indian Ocean. For Britain, this was of immense strategic importance, as it shortened the sea route to India. Although Britain did not own the canal outright, it intervened militarily in Egypt in 1882 and established a long-lasting occupation, even though Egypt was not formally classified as part of the empire at that time. Towards the end of the 19th century, European powers engaged in what is often called the Scramble for Africa. During this period, Britain acquired extensive territories in eastern and southern Africa. Ambitious schemes, such as building a railway from the Cape to Cairo, were proposed, although such projects were never fully realized. As the 20th century began, Britain's dominance in world trade and its willingness to act as a kind of global policeman allowed it to exert influence even over countries not formally within the empire, such as China, Argentina, and Siam. In 1902, an undersea telegraph network known as the All Red Line was completed, enabling rapid communication between London and almost every part of the empire. Over time, many of Britain's predominantly white colonies developed economically and socially to the point where they demanded greater political autonomy. Canada became a confederation in 1867 and was granted self-government in most internal matters, apart from foreign affairs. Australia and New Zealand followed a similar path around 1900, becoming self-governing dominions. Ireland also sought greater independence during this period. Several Home Rule bills were introduced in the British Parliament, aiming to give Ireland its own parliament while keeping it within the United Kingdom. These bills failed repeatedly, partly due to fears that conceding autonomy to Ireland might weaken the unity of the empire as a whole. The real existential threat to the empire, however, came not from Ireland, but from the rise of Germany and the outbreak of the First World War in 1914. During this conflict, Britain relied heavily on its empire for food, raw materials, and troops. Over 2.5 million men from the dominions and colonies, especially Canada, India, Australia, and New Zealand, served in the war, many losing their lives. Britain and its allies ultimately defeated Germany and the Ottoman Empire, gaining control over large areas of the Middle East, Africa, and the Pacific. Yet the war was enormously costly. Although territorial gains were made, the strain on British finances and manpower marked the beginning of imperial decline. In 1921, the empire reached its greatest geographical extent, but in the same year, Ireland gained its independence, signaling that the age of unquestioned imperial authority was ending. The Second World War, beginning in 1939, temporarily delayed the process of decolonization, as Britain once again called upon its empire for economic and military support. While Britain and its allies emerged victorious in 1945, the country was left financially exhausted and no longer able to sustain its sprawling empire. Over the following decades, the 1940s, 1950s, 1960s, and 1970s, most of Britain's colonies and dominions gained independence. This wave of decolonization, often described as the wind of change, brought nearly 4 centuries of formal British imperial history to a close. However, independence did not necessarily mean a complete break with Britain. Many newly independent states chose to remain linked through a loose association known as the Commonwealth. 14 of these countries also retained the British monarch as their head of state. For many observers, a powerful symbol of the end of the British Empire was the handover of Hong Kong to China in 1997. Nevertheless, the legacy of the empire is still very much present today. The English language has become the most widely spoken language in the world, and many aspects of British culture, institutions, and legal practices remain influential across the globe. Modern Britain itself can be seen as a small reflection of this imperial past, a society in which people from nearly every former colony and from many different races, religions, and cultures now live on the same islands where the empire's long and complex story first began.